Hello, and welcome to the Fresh Air Sci-Fi Show. I'm Joe.
And I'm Dave.
And I hope you're all well. It's another week, another Tuesday. But to start off the stream, we've got a little bit of good news. We had a couple more people subscribe. We've had Memento Mori. We've been chatting to him on in regards to a couple of our mini streams. So we've also been doing highlights, which I'll get to in a second. And we've also had Kate Kim join us. So thank you very much, Kate, as well. Kate's actually one of the members of our debate group. So Kate, why is it taking you so long to subscribe? No, just playing. Thank you for subscribing. Always great to have anyone there. Anyone watching now, if you would be so kind, please press that button. Thank you very much. And yes, so we've also started doing highlights of our videos. So we understand that sometimes these topics are rather lengthy, and we do go off piste a little bit, especially with yeah, Dave, yeah. I'm quite easily distracted at the best of times, as I'm sure you've noticed, and will happily answer any questions that come in from the audience. So we do have sometimes quite long videos, and we've started cutting out little bits for people to just have a quick listen to. You know, if you don't have time for the full stream, but actually I've got 10 minutes, you could probably get 5 of the shorts in, and maybe you'll go, actually, that's a topic that does interest me. I'm going to check out the rest of that video. Or perhaps you'll go, what a load of trash, I'm not going to bother. You know, whatever. But at least you get an idea, a feel for the longer stream, and you can see if it's actually worth your time investing that 1-2 hours of your time. So hopefully that'll work. We've already getting some more comments and engagement from people, so it seems to be working, but it's early days. Any thoughts on that? Any ideas? Any suggestions? Of course, my inbox is always open at admin@answers-in-reason.com. That's admin@answersinreason.com. And of course, you can get us off on any social media outlet or even in the YouTube comment section. We're pretty easy how we communicate with you. Although I prefer not Facebook Messenger. Happy for Facebook, but just not Facebook Messenger.
It's horrible.
It is. It's really horrible, especially now that they've made it its own app. It's a bit like,
It runs really slow on my phone. My phone's no slouch.
Yeah, it's a clunky bit of equipment, really, I think is the only fair way to say. But
yeah.
But yeah, so that's our good little bit of news. I suppose we should get on with the night, Dave. So tonight we are discussing Plato's Meno. We called it "Don't Be So Meno to Me." Now, if you're have been watching recently, you will understand that what we have been doing is discussing discussions quite a bit. So to put it as briefly as possible, we have been holding discussions about different ways people can communicate and whether they're heuristic or dialectic. That's to say, whether they're having a fight or actually trying to have a conversation and try and reach some form of truth. So to finish up this segment of discussing discussions, which is actually quite a tongue twister, especially if you say it really fast.
That's why I chose it.
Bastard.
Yep.
Dave has suggested that we have a look at Plato's Meno, in which Socrates is having a conversation with a character called Meno, and it highlights the differences between an heuristic and dialectic debate style. Now, we're not going to go over the whole Meno. I think you've worked out a few bits that you'd like to go over in particular, haven't you, Dave?
Yeah. Just a few segments from it that show kind of how a Socratic dialogue goes and how to react to somebody who's being kind of combative, and it's an interesting dialogue.
Yeah, awesome. Well, you've got until I finish my Long Island iced tea.
Yeah, but you're an alcoholic. You'll drink it in 2 minutes.
Well, I'll alternate my sips.
That's a funny looking Long Island iced tea.
Well, no, that's the Long Island iced tea.
Yeah, I was going to say, it's changed color.
Yeah, well, that's the vodka.
Oh, okay, that makes sense.
Could you imagine? Actually, one of the first times I ever got drunk, someone made me a pint of vodka with that much lemonade in it, and I was so drunk at the time. I was probably 13 years old or whatever, and you know what you like at that age. Yeah, I can take my drink, and I was already drunk, and someone gave me a drink like that because they were finding it funny. And yes, you can imagine where it ended up. But the worst part of it was at the time I'd got some of that, that fake spray and dye where you get like the purple one and the green one, and I'd done that either side of my hair just for a laugh that night. And the person's house that we'd gone to, all along the side of the wall where I'd been sat for hours and leaning and swaying up and down, was green. And then I had to clean that in the state I was in. And it ended up taking like paint off and everything like that. So it's like, I mean, so if anyone ever offers you a pint of clear liquid and you're drunk and you think, oh, it's weak, it's just like water, it might not be. Pour the water yourself.
Yeah.
So Dave, I think we need to briefly switch over. So shall I put it on be right back mode so you can sort it out, the screen share?
Yeah, no worries.
What am I gonna do today, man? Oh, give a bicycle. You always have some great ideas for what to do.
Okay, good be up.
Hey, yo,
This one. Hey, it worked.
Nice one. We're getting good at this.
Bit by bit.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay, so this translation isn't a standard translation. It's a new one, and it's from Sophie Grace Chappell.
All right. How's she doing?
I'm not sure. I haven't spoken to her for a while. This was part of my coursework.
I see. And why is her translation so different from the others?
It's just newer and contains some slightly different wording based on people like Dominic Scott and Russell and Weiss, who have said maybe some of the older translations should look at it slightly differently.
Fair. I mean, have you read both, like the original sort of translations, and compared it to this? And
I've read a few. They're pretty much the same, but slightly different wording in places that just makes it slightly clearer.
Yeah, fair.
I'm a little too knackered to go through the exact ones at the minute, but I mean, if anybody ever wanted me to, I could.
Okay. No worries. I mean, that's not what tonight's about anyway. I was just curious.
Oh, no, understandable. I was when I first read it. Okay, so the dialogue is between Meno and Socrates. Meno was sort of an upper class in Greece, and he was a student of Gorgias, who was a philosopher from Thessaly.
Okay.
And he was what Plato considered a sophist. So rather than a philosopher, he considered him a rhetorician. So he was good at dialogue, he was good at speaking, and he had, rather than teach somebody philosophy, he would teach them answers to questions, and the people would repeat those questions. And that's basically what Meno kind of does.
Right. Fair. So it's sort of like a current education system in the UK.
Something like that, yeah.
Yeah. I'll start ranting about education, though. Let's move on.
The dialogue revolves around virtue and whether or not it's teachable. So it opens with Meno asking that question, is it teachable? Do we learn it by practice? Is it habit? Where does it come from? Is it nature? And so there's a bit of dialogue beforehand where Socrates kind of insults Meno a little without directly insulting him. But he talks about how it's Gorgias who's taught him, and how Gorgias is good at oratorical stuff, and teaches people responses rather than teaches them to answer questions. He's quite sly, Socrates, yeah.
My kind of guy. I wonder if it'd have been good to have a beer with. Would he just sit there going, "What is beer? Why would you have a beer with me?"
He liked his wine in his young boys, so possibly.
I'm not so young anymore.
Younger than he is. Sorry, I was just reading the chat.
Yeah, so was I. Hey Josiah, hey LB, nice to see you here.
Hey Josiah, hey LB.
I must say, I really enjoyed the pun. I managed to stifle the laugh so I didn't interrupt Dave. But yeah, and what we're doing today, if you missed it, LB, was we are going over the Meno. We're not going into it to the whole thing, but we're just continuing our discussions about discussions and the example of someone who is heuristic versus dialectic by looking at the Meno. And that will sort of wrap up our discussions on discussions for now, unless we get further questions that people would like us to carry on discussing said discussions.
Yeah. So the dialogue opens with Meno asking Socrates about virtue, Socrates kind of playfully insulting him. But then Socrates does his usual thing of, well, I don't actually know what virtue is, so I can't answer this question. So maybe we should go through it and try and figure out what virtue is. And because Socrates knows that Meno was taught by Gorgias, he kind of gets him to speak about how Gorgias is the kind of person who gives an answer and doesn't really teach people how to think, but what to think.
Hmm.
And then he tries to convince Meno to speak of his own words.
Yeah, which, I mean, we could apply that to many conversations that we actually have ourselves, couldn't we, Dave, with people online who seem to be repeating something, whether they're a theist or an atheist or anything like that. There's common phrases and buzzwords that you hear that you're just a bit like, right, but can you put that in your own words?
Yeah, I mean, a lot of people do it. It's quite common, especially if you've just learned something because you haven't really thought about it or got into that discussion much. You'll basically repeat what you've been told. I mean, I do it. Everybody does it. But you should be learning down the line, and that's basically what Socrates is trying to teach Meno here. That it's fair enough to repeat something, but eventually you have to learn how to phrase that in your own words, and you need to learn how to argue it.
Mm-hmm.
So the first thing he does is he asks Meno to define what virtue is. And Meno's answer is that virtue is different for men and women. For a man, virtue is running a city's affairs, running them to benefit his friends and harm his enemies. A woman's virtue is looking after the home, the property. Child's virtue is different to an old person's virtue.
So he basically describes gender roles instead of virtue.
Instead of virtue, yeah, basically.
And by gender, obviously, I'm splitting that into, the expected behaviours of a particular sex at different ages in their life as well. So that's why you'd have, a female child as a gender in its whole versus an aged man being something else. And yeah, Cool.
Yeah, exactly. And of course, this doesn't really tell us what virtue is,
No.
because, I mean, if virtue is just running a city well, then is it only statesmen that can have virtue? And that's the kind of thing that Socrates brings up here.
Mm.
Socrates then says, I was only after one virtue, but he's found a whole swarm of them.
Mm.
And then he uses that to go into the idea of a unitary definition. So, one definition that covers all instances of virtue and all different kinds of virtue, and a unitary definition for men, women. So, he talks about bees here. Are there different things when it comes to bees, or is there one single thing that defines beeness? Yeah, and that's kind of what you want when you have a discussion, isn't it? It's you want something defined that you can actually look at and explore and gain knowledge from.
Mm-hmm.
And you also want it to actually cover the subject that you're talking about.
Yeah, indeed. Yeah, I'm still stuck on him describing genders as virtue. But, you know.
Yeah. I suppose... Sorry.
No, I was going to say, I suppose I can understand it, because you can say, well, there's certain virtuous things that you might expect of a man, like more chivalrous behavior. Obviously, going back in time when obviously we didn't have the creature comforts that we do now, and you would have more standard gender roles, I can understand that obviously you'd more expect a female to be more of a homemaker and the male to be the one going off earning the money, fighting the wars and all of that sort of thing. So you could attack it from, these are behaviors you'd expect from a virtuous male or a virtuous female, but that still doesn't tell you what virtue is. And that's what he's asking. What is virtue? Not give me some examples where you could point out virtue.
Yeah, exactly. Plato's asked him for what virtue is, and he's pointed him to examples of virtue. So it would be the same as sort of like saying, what is a game? And somebody says, well, football, tennis, tiddlywinks, Scrabble, they're games. But that doesn't tell you what a game is. It just points out examples of certain games.
And you get someone to go, well, Call of Duty in there as well. And you go, oh, that's made it even more confusing, because if that's a game and that's a game and they're so completely different, what do you mean by a game?
Yeah, exactly. And that's something I'll bring up in a bit when talking about unitary definitions.
Oh.
Yeah. So Socrates says, can you define bees in one type of thing? The single beeness, and he wants something similar to from Meno about virtue. Oops. So Meno says, well, I don't quite know what you mean. So here we see an example of, in a good discussion, you want clear terms. And part of the dialogue is getting the person you're having a discussion with to understand the terms as well.
Yep.
I know that one's kind of obvious, but it's always worth pointing out, because think of the amount of times we see people have a discussion about atheism, and they're just arguing different definitions. They haven't spent any time at all getting clear, or say morality or ethics, or
they end up spending so much time discussing the semantics of what they're trying to discuss that they don't actually get to the meat of the topic. And if you start at the beginning and you go, Right, this is the platform we're working off. We agreed with this sort of thing. How would you like to tweak it and twist it and start with one that everyone's happy? So, I mean, we could, for example, if we were to have a discussion with someone who wanted to talk about atheism as a lack of belief, even though we hold to atheism being the belief gods do not exist, we understand that there are other atheists out there that don't hold to that definition. And if they said, no, this is how I want to discuss the following conversation, then we'd go, okay, we can use it for now. We might explore how it would be different if we used our definition to yours, but let's go with yours. We're then set on that, and we know what they mean by what they're saying when they say atheist.
Exactly. And this is one of the things that Plato's trying to get us to understand here as well, is that if we're having a discussion with someone, we should try to use the terms as they use them. And because they already come to the argument with a bit of, or the discussion with a bit of knowledge, and you work on their terms, because then you can kind of get at the meat of the discussion, like you say, rather than spending time arguing about how it should be defined.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that makes a lot of sense to me.
So Socrates here, because he doesn't understand, he tries to think of a nice, simple way of showing what he means by a unitary definition. Because he argues that virtue is different for a man or a woman, he uses the example of health, size, and strength. Is there one sort of health for a man and another for women? Or is there the same form of health in all these cases? So he's trying to bring out the idea of the unitary definition and how one word can be the same for all different groups.
Mm.
And I know that's what a lot of atheists kind of do with the lack of belief.
Mm-hmm.
A lot of them will say, well, yeah, but the person who believes there is no God still lacks belief.
Which is true.
Yeah.
It still lacks belief in gods. Should we just clarify that point?
Yeah.
We don't lack belief in God not existing. No, we believe gods don't exist, but we also lack belief in gods. It follows.
Exactly. I mean, it's slightly different because it's a self-ascribed definition, but it sort of gets the idea that they do have a unitary definition for all people who claim to be atheist. So you can work from that unitary definition and build up from that.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, you could. I mean, we'd prefer to use non-theists for that, because we'd like to describe the various ontological positions. But as you said, for the sake of a conversation, you can say, right, we'll go with your definitions. Let's build up from here. Let's see what we can find.
Yeah, exactly. And by doing that, you might even be able to convince them that there is a better way to use the terms. But if you just steam in going, nope, that's not the best way to use the terms, let's use my terms, you're not really going to get a discussion from them.
Yeah, fair.
Sorry, I'm just going through it. And I should have noted down the sections, but it's been a long day.
That's all right, dude.
So he goes through the argument, and he goes through it bit by bit, and he kind of shows that by using temperance and justice. So if a man does something, a man does X and a woman does Y, there has to be temperance and justice. They have to come with certain characteristics to be considered virtuous. So you can acquire, Meno talks about acquiring goods as part of virtue.
Mm-hmm.
But if acquiring goods was all that it took to be virtuous, then robbing a temple would be virtuous because you've acquired goods.
Yeah.
But unless you do it with justice and honesty, it's not really virtuous. So it's not the acquisition of goods that's the virtue. It's how it's done. So he sort of brings him around to it slightly.
Yeah, fair.
And that's important in a discussion, like I say, because you want the other side before moving on. You want the other side to understand the subject and come to an agreement with you. So it's always best to go through slowly and break it down.
Yeah. Yeah, no, I agree with that. Although I was thinking, sorry to go slightly off piste, but like when you have the conversation with people about morality, and someone will do, when I covered off the feedback on morality and misconceptions, and some people talk about a split between ethics and morality, and there are a few different ways people approach it, but one of them is they go, morality is your personal values and ethics is your society's values. So basically, morality is subjective morality and ethics is relative morality. Now, obviously, they're actually types of morality. In that sort of situation, how would you unpick that? Because obviously you don't necessarily want to be using their definition here for that sort of thing, because you're trying to get them to realize that actually the concept of morality is way bigger than their very, very narrow sort of take on it. Because when you describe it that way, when you're speaking of morality, it is subjective morality, then of course it's subjective. And if you're speaking of ethics and ethics is relative morality, then of course it's relative. But what about the rest of the field? What about the rest of the ideas and concepts and all of that? How can you get someone to go, okay, but when we look at it this way, can you... I mean, I've had the morality conversation a number of times, and that is one of the things where I go... I don't know. Well, I mean, we're going to talk past each other with this one, because morality is understood like this, especially when you go through a number of different papers or read, some philosophical material on it. So this understanding of morality seems to be a rebrand of one of the ethical theories. And the conversation doesn't go much further, because there's often that bit where you're like, they want to stick with their definition. And I go, we can, but we can't actually move forward with that, because it becomes almost a bit of a tautology.
yeah, absolutely. I think the best way to start with something like that would be to focus on what they think the difference between ethics and morality is. So they're saying ethics is wide, sort of nationwide or culture wide, and morality is personal. So you could focus on, well, what happens when they come into conflict? Which one becomes true? Are moral statements of truth, or are they just opinions? If you think something is moral and society thinks it's unethical, which one takes precedence?
Yeah, nice.
And then say, well, is an ethical statement different from a moral statement, or are they the same kind of properties? Are they the same kind of statements? Well, then morality isn't different from ethics.
Yeah, that's fair. That's probably a better way to go about it. I tend to just sort of try and describe how they're done, and obviously that doesn't go down particularly well, because they're stuck in their idea. But yeah, you're right. Try and unpick it in a similar way to this that we're watching right now.
That's it. You've got to get them to explore their own ideas, because, like Meno here, they might just be repeating things that they've heard. So they've heard somebody they respect say ethics and morality are different. Ethics is culture-wide or group-wide, and morality is personal. So they're just going to repeat that.
Yeah.
And that's basically what Meno's done here. He's just repeated what he's heard Gorgias say. So Socrates has done his best to sort of slowly pick it apart and get him to think about the answer.
Yeah. See how this works. Oh, by the way, hey Opie, how you doing? Nice to see you.
Hey Opie. So by going through that and saying, well, an action done in a certain way is doing something with virtue. So he gets Meno to understand that he wants one definition that covers all the cases. And Socrates generally tends to focus on unitary definitions. And it's good, but like we were talking about with games earlier, Wittgenstein says that there are certain definitions where there is no unitary definition that covers all those things. So think of a game. A video game and Scrabble are both games, and football is a game, but they don't all have a unitary definition. They have what Wittgenstein calls familial relationships, where there's a whole bunch of things that describes games, and certain games have only some of those resemblances, but we still call them games.
Yeah, and that would be sort of your big ticket thing, wouldn't it? And then you'd break it down into a board game, a computer game, and all computer games have a similarity in the sense that they're things that are played on a computer. But even then, you could get a board game inside of a computer game that you're not playing on a real board, you're playing on a computer.
Exactly. So it's more sort of how we've come to describe certain things. So when Socrates says, you've given me a swarm of definitions, well, that might actually be the case in some cases, where we describe things not based on a singular definition, but based on properties or based on groups. So it's always worth remembering that while we might be able to give a unitary definition, it's not always the case. So bringing it back to something like atheism, we have two different definitions. Both are atheism. Both might have a common property in that both groups lack a belief in the existence of gods, but they're defined slightly differently. And they're both self-confessed definitions to some extent. I mean, the belief God does not exist comes from philosophy, and it comes from taking a particular stance towards the proposition. But it would still be people applying that label to themselves, so to speak.
Yeah. Sorry, what you've just said as well, whilst you find your next piece, it reminded me of a conversation that I had in our debate group recently, where I was talking about someone asked a question, that Pratik, I think is his name, and he was talking about, if you give up on God and religion, do you become a nihilist or a humanist? He basically gave a bit of a false dichotomy. And I went on to describe, assuming you mean leaving religion never to come back, and you mean giving up on God, at the very least you become a non-theist. Everything from there is up for grabs. You're not necessarily going to be a nihilist. You're not necessarily going to be a humanist. You could have a bit of overlap between the two, unless you become an incredibly, strict in one of those senses of the words. And obviously we had someone jump in, and standard rhetoric of, atheism is only a lack of belief. Atheism literally means not a theist, and all of that sort of stuff. And the conversation went on, and I was explaining a couple of different bits, and there was a lot of resistance. And then he basically did if you've got something new, prove your God exists. I was like, I'm an atheist that runs an atheist site and an atheist group and an atheist podcast, an atheist video stream. I have no burden of proving gods exist. I could justify why I believe gods don't exist, but that's not what you're asking me to. But here's a few references from various atheist philosophers and this and that and all that. And he changed the second he realized that I was an atheist too. It was the change in his mind was like, Okay. And to be fair to him, he then approached it the right way and went, thanks for the links, I'll check them out and get back to you. Now, sometimes you even get resistance at that point. No, you're clearly a theist troll and all of that. That was an example of something that went the right way, but it was just an example of someone that came in swinging, I know all this shit. And when he suddenly realized, oh, we're the same.
Yeah. Well, they adopt that very, you're either with us or against us. If you're not using the same definition, you must be against us.
Yeah. Yeah, it's standard tribalism. We all do it. We're all guilty of it. It's something we need to consciously be aware of when we're doing it and when we're getting involved in these conversations. And it was interesting that at least the tribalism worked in my favor there when I was like, "Oh, I am an atheist." Suddenly he went, oh, okay. Whereas, I mean, both of us have had it before where we announce that we're an atheist. No, you're not. You're a theist troll. You're clearly a theist troll. No true atheist would say this thing.
I have software.
Yeah. That one still makes me giggle.
Yeah, I use software to track out false atheists. Okay.
Yeah. Yeah, he's just followed by a few theists. That doesn't make him not an atheist.
Yeah. Okay. Sorry, I got caught up in the conversation then. So Socrates gets Meno to see that the first definition he gave isn't suitable because it doesn't actually describe what virtue is.
Mm-hmm.
It points out different kinds of virtuous behavior, but he wants the thing that sort of kind of unifies them. And he kind of brings it out when he discusses actions being done with justice and that kind of thing.
Yeah.
So he gets Meno to give a second definition. And Meno says virtue is the capacity to rule over other people.
Mm-hmm.
And he breaks it down and says, well, a child or a slave can't rule over, but can they still behave with virtue? And Meno says, yes. So Socrates says, well, isn't ruling justly rather than unjustly virtue? And Meno accepts, yes, justice is virtue. And he says, is it virtue or a virtue?
Mm.
So he's trying to...
Oh, you minimized your application, Dave.
Hit the wrong button. Typical. So here we kind of come back to the Wittgensteinian idea where something could have a familial relationship. So maybe there isn't a unitary definition of virtue. Virtue is behaving according to the virtues rather than a singular type of thing. It's behaving with certain patterns of behavior.
Mm-hmm.
So Socrates then tries to get him to understand again this idea of a unitary virtue. So he asks Meno to describe a shape. He says, a circle is a shape, but it's not simply shape.
Yeah.
So he says, well, Meno says courage, temperance, wisdom, magnificence are virtues, and there are many other. So Socrates says, well, now we're back to the same place. We want a unitary definition. We don't want the parts of virtue.
Mm.
So he kind of sticks to this idea that we must hash out our definitions before we can move on to the actual question. Because if neither of us knows what something is, how can we possibly discuss it?
Mm.
And you get that a lot with, say, going back to atheists and agnosticism. Agnosticism just deals with knowledge. well, no, that's not quite true. So in order to get them to understand it, you would have to kind of hash this out before you can actually move on to the discussion about agnosticism. It show the dialogue kind of shows why it's necessary, because all Meno wants is this answer. But if he can't actually describe what virtue is, then how will he ever know when he gets the answer to the question? Like, if I asked you, what is atheism, and you just said, well, it's just a lack of belief in gods, and I say, well, here's this other definition. What about this one? And they just flat out deny that other definition exists. Well, then you can never truly have that discussion about atheism or Gnosticism, or taking it back to the ethics and morality distinction. As long as they have that false idea, you can never truly have a conversation about it. Which is, why it's so important to hash out these definitions before any real discussion can go on.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, I think it's one of the things that I've learned from a lot of conversations online is having that bit at the beginning. The problem is when you get someone responding to a post of yours or something like that, and they're coming in hot with, no, this is the definition. And you're already then at a point where you're like, okay, we sort of have to try and take a step back and start a conversation again, even though it's halfway through and you're responding to this post that's about this and done that. That's why, I mean, in a lot of the articles that I've done, especially of late, but I think even going back to some of my early ones, I've always have definitions used at the front of the article. And if it's something I'm aware is polysemous, like atheism, and is a point of contention for many atheists, I say, I'm using this definition of atheism. I understand many might be using the lack of belief definition. I'm using the one I prefer for myself, like this. But I will maybe show you how it's also done using your definition as well later on.
Yeah, exactly. It's like shown in the dialogue. It's always good to meet in the middle ground, but meeting in the middle ground isn't always enough. You still have to push to come to a common understanding. And if they're holding a bad definition, like Meno is with virtue, it needs to be hashed out before any real dialogue can happen.
Yeah, that's fair. Before we move on, we've just had a question come in from LB. He says, how did humanism, originally from Christians, become an atheist's philosophical stand-in for atheists? I suppose that was supposed to be stance, and that was an autocorrect, maybe. I don't know. Do you want me to hypothesize why? I would say that obviously there is a lot of benefit to the humanist stance, and I can understand why plenty of atheists would go to that, especially because we atheists like to tell ourselves that we are more moral than Christians because the Bible makes so many evils permissible, etc. So therefore, we want something that's good for humans, and being a humanist is, I suppose, one of those cornerstones. So I'm not sure all atheists would be. I think it's probably more on the liberal side of atheists in general. You probably get some very conservative or libertarian style Christians that are more atheists that are more focused on themselves and their family and things like that, rather than thinking of humans in general. But I do think there is a leaning towards humanism for atheists who have spent time thinking about things and wanting to be as moral as can be.
Yeah, I mean, it's basically the idea that we can't speak directly to God. All we can go by is people's interpretation of the Bible. So we're still relying on humans anyway. So the humanist idea is that we can only rely on ourselves, even if we have these books, because it's still us interpreting the book. So what we should do is kind of maybe put the books aside and come to an understanding between all of us and figure out what's best for making a society that progresses with us. Now, an argument could be made here that it's influenced by Christianity, like LB says, it comes from Christianity. But our history means that almost everything has been influenced by Christianity. I know a lot of atheists won't like this, but Christianity permeated our society for a very long time. And it's only in the last couple of 100 years that we've started to move away from it. But it was still the foundation of how our societies progressed for a very long time. So you could argue that lots of stuff does come from Christianity, but we've moved past that now, which is what modern humanism is.
Yeah, and I think that's good as well. Just because you've got your grounding in something, I mean, look at fire. It might have started with someone rubbing sticks together or banging flint together, but you can have it in your pocket on demand at the click of a button. You don't even have to do the bit where you rotate that; you just click. So yeah, exactly. It might have come from banging rocks together, but it's not the same thing it once was.
It's progressed. Like science started a certain way, but we now have a very different kind of science.
Yeah.
But just because it came from those past things doesn't mean it's the same as those past things. We now use different ideas.
Yeah, and I mean, as Josh actually says, hi Josh, by the way.
Hey Josh.
It's a common ancestor. And actually, this is one of the things that I use when people say philosophy's dead, and about how science and maths came from philosophy. They're quite different to how they were when they first sort of arose from philosophy. They still use philosophy, especially science and the scientific method and all of that, but they are quite different entities now. And it's like the why they're still monkeys. Well, philosophy has continued to evolve as well. So let's say had the split here and they're all a bit similar and all on a little, and then they're here. Okay, and quite different entities that are symbiotic with certain fields that go back and forth, but they are quite different things now. So you could say the same with anything that came from Christianity. This was the Christian version, and like all the millions of different denominations, humanism as it once was is now over here. And there probably is Christian humanism versus secular humanism. I haven't looked too much into this one myself, just humanism in general, but I imagine there is a slightly different take on it. Some using more biblical virtues and morals, whereas others is looking for more of a humanist side to it without the biblical stuff. There's a few other comments. Opie says it was after the Four Horsemen with Silverman and Dillahunty. That's sort of when it changed. And Josh says, I'd say it because it encompasses typical atheist beliefs with leaving a loophole for godlessness. Yeah, that's fair. So LB says also, not necessarily Christianity, but just the theist and deist thinkers as well, with the exception of David Hume. He was an atheist. Yeah. But he's one of your favorite philosophers as well.
Yeah.
Even though you disagree with him on morality.
Yeah. He describes a part of it, but not the whole. Sort of like what we're discussing here.
Yeah, definitely. But yeah, I hope that answers your question, LB. If you got any more, let us know. But a time for you to carry on, Dave.
Well, just to go back to the thing about humanism coming from Christianity, if we think of something like evolution came from Darwin's theory, but it's no longer Darwin's theory.
No, that's true.
It's
evolution has evolved.
yeah, basically. It's heavily influenced, but it's no longer the same thing.
Exactly, and that's why there's very little point in someone arguing against Darwinian evolution, which you often see. It's almost the creationist go-to, and you're like, okay, yeah, but the ideas have come on along since then. There's still the whole natural selection bit, but that's just a part of what we understand about evolution now. And it's so much bigger. So yeah, that's a really good example to give.
It's the best. It's the first one that comes to mind, and the best one that comes to mind.
Well, it's always the best when it comes to your mind, isn't it, Dave?
Not usually. I'm not particularly bright. I just get lucky on occasion. So the dialogue continues with this second definition, and Socrates kind of brings it back to shape, and he says, "What would you give as a definition for shape?"
Mm.
And it gets kind of interesting here, because Meno, there's three different definitions of shape that are given here. And there's a difference in the way Socrates, in the definition that Socrates prefers and the definition that Meno prefers. Meno prefers a more clever sounding definition.
Right.
And Socrates prefers the more simple definition. So Meno prefers the one that makes him sound like he's really well educated, really well learned, and smarter than everybody else. And Socrates prefers the definition that anybody can understand, and he can then move on from a discussion and have a discussion about that.
Mm-hmm.
Which is what you really kind of want with people.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, no, it makes sense to keep, especially when it comes down to definitions, everything as simple as possible.
Exactly.
As long as it's also correct.
Yeah.
I know all definitions are technically valid, but if you want to have a conversation about, say, atheism, you don't want to use, as I've jokingly said, a cheese sandwich is an atheist, you know.
I mean, it's technically correct. It's not
very
good.
That's just an example, though, Dave. That's an example. That's not what atheism actually is.
No. So, what happens here is Socrates tries to get Meno to give him a definition of shape. And Meno kind of argues, well, no, you give me the definition. I wanted a discussion about virtue. You're talking about shapes now. What's all this about? You tell me the definition of shape.
Mm.
And Socrates says, well, if I give you this definition, will you then talk to me about virtue? And Meno agrees.
Yeah.
So,
well, interestingly, though, I mean, this is something that I find frustrates others in conversations that I'm having with them, where I say, okay, let's put a pin in this just for a second. Let's try and address it through another medium. If we were to think about it this way, so for example, talking about defining things purely by what we lack, you know, is baldness just a lack of hair? Well, it's not, because someone can shave their head and they're not technically bald, they're a skinhead. Baldness is actually something that comes due to usually having like too much testosterone or too much stress, basically a hormonal imbalance of some kind, or just old age, so the hair's getting thinner. There's always something else to what makes someone actually bald versus someone who's decided to shave their head. So you wouldn't necessarily refer to someone who's bald as a skinhead and vice versa. I know in some countries that there might not necessarily be that separation, but at least within the English language, that's how it's done. And there are not many things described based purely on what they lack, especially not just one thing that they lack. There's always a multiple of things that they lack to describe that.
Yeah, usually our definitions give rise to some property or state of affairs rather than a lack of state of affairs, apart from broke.
Yeah. Yeah.
That defines a lack of money, but it doesn't just define a lack of money. It also defines an economic condition.
Yes, where your outgoings are probably at a point where they're higher than your income, or at least your you've got yourself into a situation where your income and outcome's exactly the same, and what you've got left over at it is the end is nothing.
Yeah,
For
exactly.
example. Yeah. So again, even then, even though the simple bit is someone who doesn't have enough money, and there you go, I've qualified it by saying enough money, because as you mentioned there, it's the economic state around everything that's involved. You wouldn't necessarily say a child was broke, because a child's finances are based on the parents' finances. You know?
Exactly. The child lacks money, like most people say somebody who's broke lacks money, but you wouldn't call a child broke. You know,
it's a different position that they've got. It's So again, there is more than just a lack of money, more than just one thing that they lack.
Yeah, exactly. And I think I kind of wish people thought about that more when it comes to atheism. It's more than just the psychological state. It's a stance, or can be a stance on the question: does God exist?
Yeah. I think we're preaching to the choir right now, though.
Oh yeah, obviously. So in the conversation, Socrates then goes on to define shape in order to please Meno. So, you scratch my back, I'll scratch yours kind of thing. And Socrates defines shape as the only thing among existence that always accompanies color. Quite a simple definition.
Shape turns out to be the only thing among existence that always accompanies color. Interesting.
Yeah. I mean, if you think about a shape, I mean, you could go with, say, translucent, but that's still kind of a color.
Stretching it, but yeah.
Yeah. So it's a very simple definition, like really simple definition. But color usually comes with some form of shape.
No, thinking about it more, in my head, I was thinking of an outline on a piece of paper where you just draw, say, a circle. But then, again, it comes with the color. You've got the color of the lead, and you've got the blankness in the middle and the color of the paper. And you can see that this shape, because of this color that's gone around. Sorry, it took me a while to catch up with what he actually meant by that. I was sitting there going, I feel like a right idiot right now. I'm sitting here reading this going, what the fuck? But I think I've caught up.
Yeah, I mean, like I say, it's a simple definition, but it does actually describe most shapes. Most shapes come with some kind of color. They come with an outline or a surface area that's a particular color.
Yeah. I mean, even in the something that's translucent. Going back to what you were saying about translucent, so even translucent isn't a color itself, but because of the way that light refracts around it and all of that, and anything that you might possibly see through it, it does give it a color that isn't the same as the space around it. So
exactly.
Yeah, no, I get your point now. I'm sorry it took me so long to catch up.
That's all right. I give you these benefits of the doubt, Meno. So Meno calls this one naive because it's simplistic. It's like, well, it's not very posh, is it? It doesn't make you sound very clever. It might be true, but I mean, what Meno says, what happens if somebody doesn't know what color is?
Yeah. Yeah. So would you go on to describe what a color is? I mean, that's a difficult one to actually describe color. That's one of the things that's really hard to do without either giving examples or trying to explain wavelengths.
Yeah.
And back then they wouldn't have had the wavelengths example, so all they would have had is different trying to go different shades of different. Yeah, how do you describe color without having the scientific understanding of how our eyes perceive things differently? That's actually quite a difficult thing to do.
Yeah, definitely. And I mean, there was a lot of people back then who thought that our eyes sent out beams and scanned things in and then took that in. And that's how we got color and saw the world around us, rather than stuff coming into our eyes.
Mm.
So, yeah, it could be very difficult.
So just before you carry on with that, Opie says, shape of fossil melanosum impressions infer colour. Yeah, that's fair, actually. You'll have to come on and show us some of your fossils at some point, Opie.
Yeah, that would be very cool.
And LB says he's going to play devil's advocate on this one. Let's say agnosticism is based purely on knowledge. At some point, can one say beliefs have knowledge? So you could say knowledge influences other beliefs. So if I have knowledge that I have tried 3 different types of chocolate and I liked all 3 of them, it might inform my belief that I like chocolate in general. But yeah, I mean, is that basically what you were asking? Is that the same as what you get from that, Dave?
Sort of. I mean, knowledge is beliefs anyway. Like if I say I believe I'm holding my hand up to the camera now, I also know that I'm holding my, because I can see it and I'm doing it and it's there.
Yeah.
But it's still a belief. So beliefs can have knowledge.
In that sense, yeah, because knowledge is essentially a subset of belief. But it's the phrasing of the question,
It's a bit ambiguous.
Yeah, as in, can one say beliefs have knowledge? Beliefs are something that we hold. Yeah. As Josh says, I believe I exist. He also knows he exists. But yeah, I think the only way to really sort of separate the two is if you're talking about, you can have a belief that arises from your knowledge, which is obviously a stronger form of a previous belief. And you can have it sort of going in that sort of pattern, your knowledge informs your belief. I mean, even beliefs inform other beliefs. If you believe it's going to rain tomorrow, you'll probably believe that you should dress warm and wear a raincoat in the morning, and you might believe that it's a good idea to leave your brolly by the back door, so that when you leave, you don't forget it. Beliefs can inform other beliefs. Knowledge can definitely inform other beliefs. But saying, beliefs have knowledge is a bit ambiguous. But hopefully that's cleared up what you were asking.
Hopefully. You got to remember, we're not particularly bright, LB, so you got to be quite expansive.
Yeah, pretend like we're 5 years old. Except you're not allowed to chastise my drinking.
I am 5. Well, my IQ is anyway.
My mental age, yeah.
Yeah. Okay, so back to the Meno. Oops. Sorry, we get easily distracted.
Is that what we're doing?
Yeah. So here, you can see Meno has started to become slightly more competitive. Well, okay, that definition it might do, but it's not good enough. Well, how do you do? What about this? And Socrates then turns around and says, well, I've given him the truth. If my questioner was one of those wise men of the disputatious and combative sort, so if my questioner was eristic, I'd say, well, I've stated my view. If it's mistaken, it's up to you to take my statement in hand and refute it. If we were friends, like Meno and Socrates is at the moment, he would want to discuss the dialogue together, more gently and more dialectically. In other words, explore the question together, not as rivals, but as explorers.
Yeah, which makes sense. And I suppose we should try and encourage everyone to take every conversation they have online, at least the first time, to try and be that more gentle and dialectically, to try and reach that truth. I can understand if there's a particular person that's been nagging at you or posting the same crazy crap that you might not have the patience for them. But I generally say, unless they're outright doing harm, just ignore them.
Just walk away.
Yeah, stop giving them a platform. I've said that about so many of the... There's a few big, crazy theists on Twitter. And I'm not saying all theists. I'm talking about the ones that are really over the head. They constantly say what they say, more for sort of likes and stuff like that. And they'll say things that are trying to get people riled up and comments and all that sort of thing. And I keep saying to people, why do you keep quote tweeting them? Why do you keep retweeting them and commenting on their stuff? All you're doing is giving them more presence on Twitter. If everyone was to ignore this person, then all of a sudden you'd find that you wouldn't be seeing much of them anymore. And I think there is something to be said about ignoring people when they need it.
Oh, yeah. You don't throw petrol on a fire, you starve it of oxygen.
Really good way of putting it. You're on form, Dave. For someone who hasn't slept much in the last couple of weeks, I think you're on fire now.
Oh no, maybe I should stop sleeping altogether.
That'd be amazing.
I'd be an Socrates. I wouldn't be able to actually say anything because I'd be delirious and hallucinating, but the thoughts would be there.
Okay, just before we carry on, we've had a really off-topic question from LB. What's your favourite fruit to eat? Apples is always my go-to. I love strawberries and raspberries as well. And I quite like mango, but mango is one of those hit and miss ones. They're probably my favourites. Pineapple's okay as well. But I just tend to like fruit in general. What about you, Dave?
I only eat nachos and chocolate.
And curry.
And curry. And I had sausage and mash tonight.
Fair. Nice.
But yeah, I don't generally eat a lot of fruit.
Although in your curries, there's probably a tomato occasionally.
Coconut milk.
There you go.
That'll do.
I
eat bananas on occasion because they're quite tasty.
I find with bananas, there's only like a day where I actually like the taste. They go green, 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 and they go lighter and lighter, and they're good when they're still partially green, but mostly yellow. And then a day after that, and then they start getting all the little black spots on them, and they just taste funny. But yeah,
I can eat them up until they actually start looking bruised.
But yes, that was off topic. Well done. You've managed to get us to go so off piste. That's more than I've ever done. But
no, we've come in discussing one thing and gone out discussing alcohol.
Yeah, that's true.
Yeah.
Now all I've got, because he said he likes apples, bananas, and berries. I've got there's a Sesame Street thing that Ivy listens to sometimes, where it constantly goes, I like to eat apples and bananas, and it just repeats that over and over again, and then it changes the sound. Instead of eat, it's oat, and all the different sort of vowel sounds to try and teach them that. No, that's just going to be in my head for the rest of the show. So damn you, LB.
I mean, I can be sort of summed up with that. I like to eat. Just stop the statement there, and that describes me.
Yeah. If only we weren't doing a talk show / video show, we'd probably both be sat here just stuffing our faces. In fact, actually, with Thursday's stream coming up, because we're sort of talking about movies, can we have popcorn?
I was tempted to ask. She's going out to Marks and Spencer's tomorrow. So I'm kind of tempted for her to get some popcorn so I can eat it on stream.
Do it. We'll both sit
Yeah.
with popcorn and really annoy everyone.
Yeah, discuss movies and annoy people.
Wicked. My Thursday is going to be amazing.
Okay, so sorry, I keep getting distracted.
It's only because I keep distracting you, Dave.
It's easily done. ADHD and all that.
Yeah, the pair of us. I'm surprised we actually managed to get through a topic ever.
We've got topics?
Yeah, the nutty ones.
Yeah. So Socrates then carries on. Sorry, bringing us back. Socrates comes up with another definition for shape. So he discusses shape as the boundary of a solid or a surface.
Yeah.
It's the limit of a solid.
Yeah.
The boundary.
That's
So
sort of what I was saying with the outline. Showed the differing colours on your outline, even on a piece of paper. You've got that because that boundary is in a different colour. So cool. I'm with you, Socrates. I get you. I get you.
So what he does first is he makes sure that Meno understands what he means by boundary and limit. So when he gives him that definition, he can't really complain. I mean, he does, but again, it's an example of why we should work with what the other person understands.
Yeah.
Because that's what we're trying to do, is we're trying to reach an understanding. So if we go with the way they use the things, we can then start from a level and increase that level, rather than me start here and you start there, or you start there and me start here. We both sort of start about there and then work our way up to there. And that's the best way for a dialectical discussion to progress.
Yeah. Get everybody on the same level playing field, or everyone on the same page, whatever cliche you want to use. Yeah, that makes a lot of sense.
Yeah. And of course, Meno does complain. So Meno asks, what's color? And Socrates is like, well, you said that you would give me this definition of virtue if I gave you a definition of shape, and now you're moving on. So in other words, he's becoming more and more heuristic and combative as it goes on. He's kind of realized that he can't answer Socrates' question. And rather than admit that he can't answer Socrates' question, he kind of tries to keep it on Socrates. And we'll often find that, like in discussions with atheists and theists, we'll find that when they don't know a particular topic, they'll just keep attacking you, or keep the discussion away from them having to explain things, and just keep piling it on to you. Yeah.
Or even, I mean, there's been a couple of bits in here where Meno's turned around and said, well, you tell me this. And it's when I've been sort of having these conversations with, whether it's an atheist or a theist or some other ontological position, where I've been questioning them. And they've turned around and said, they've just gone, get to the point. You give me the definition. I was like, no, well, I'm trying to find your understanding on this topic so that I know where we're at. We can make certain agreements of it and move forward together from there. Like, no, I don't have time for that. Just get to the point. And you go, well, if I just do that, we're jumping around it. And there's a lot of stuff. I mean, this is quite a complex topic that we're actually discussing. So if I give you, my statement on this topic, it might not make sense to you, and you might be quite resistant to it until I've made sure that we've actually understand what I mean by what I'm about to say. And they just go, blah, blah, blah. Okay, fine. And if you ever turn around and go, all right, fine, this is my thoughts on the matter, they'll then jump in straight away. No. because you haven't built up that understanding. But equally, they're quite resistant to even building up that understanding in the first place. And sometimes it could be because they're quite confident of their understanding themselves. They think they know everything. I think it's always important to go into a debate trying to think that I might not know all I think I know about this topic, and my partner in this discussion might not have the same knowledge as me. They might know more than me, but they might not have some of the bits of knowledge. So let's try and work together, first of all, and work out, you've done your definitions bit. Now you're doing your knowledge about the topic bit and going, right, now we know what we understand about this topic, and I've learnt this from you, and you've learnt this bit from me. Now when I say this, it'll actually make sense to you. But it can be hard to get people through those stages because people are just, this is what it is. This is my definition, and this is everything about this topic that is right, and everything else is wrong. And you're just like, okay.
Yeah, that's sort of what's happening here in the dialogue, is that Socrates is giving a definition. Meno has given his definition, and it's turned out, well, his definitions don't actually cover it. And he doesn't want to have to accept that because, as far as he's concerned, he came to this discussion knowing everything about virtue. And it's turned out he doesn't know anything. So he wants to defend that position. He wants to keep hold of the idea that he is knowledgeable.
Mm.
And that happens a lot.
Yes. Yeah, I think that's a lot of the problem when there is ego in any debate. And it's hard to separate yourself from ego. It's hard to swallow your pride, admit you could be wrong, that you don't know as much as you thought you did, especially if you've started off the conversation, I know everything about X, and someone goes, well, what about Y? And they, oh, you're just wrong, you're an idiot.
Yes, Aaron Raw.
Aw, poor little
one. Yeah.
So there's another question. So now back to the topic. This is from LB. Question is always a must in topics, especially on positions. I cannot say enough that there is a miscommunication issue. Yeah, like we've been discussing in previous weeks. Also, bear in mind when it comes to this stuff, they do not want the full thing or an in-depth deal. They want a short summarized version of it. I mean, that's one of the biggest problems I find with Twitter. People want these super complex topics taken down into 280 characters or whatever the quote limit is these days. And you're just like, right. And then you go give them an 11-page tweet or try and get them to read an article on the topic, and they're just like, no, you need to give me this tiny little thing. I suppose in some respects it could be seen, I mean, it's not what they're doing, but you could say, well, this is what Socrates is trying to do to get a simplistic definition. And you're like, that's fine, but that's his starting point. And I'm happy to give a simplistic definition of, say, atheism or morality or anything that, but then you need to build up from there. Because you can start really simply. What is morality? It's principles of good and bad, right and wrong behavior. There you go. That's the basics of the definition of morality. And from there, we have questions like, what's morality's purpose? How can we actually quantify whether something is good or bad? Is it just down to opinion, or are there other measures that come to? And it's really complicated, and it builds into it. And actually, you can't have these sorts of conversations in a place like Twitter, which is a shame, because I kind of like it as a platform. I've met some great people on Twitter. In fact, everyone who's in the chat room now joining in, every single one of them I've met via Twitter, and these are great people. But they're people that have taken the time to have a conversation, even when we've had disagreements on things. We've built and we've got an understanding. Maybe my opinions change, maybe their opinions change, maybe we've agreed to disagree. It doesn't really matter. We've had a good conversation about these topics. But yeah, sorry.
That's all right. But I agree. It's like, you'll get the people on Twitter who'll be like, well, what caused World War I? And you start to give them a definition of Prussia and all that kind of stuff. And they go, Well, if you can't sum it up in 10 words or less, then you don't really know the topic.
Yeah. Okay. People.
Yeah, you know what I mean? That's an answer, and it's theoretically a correct answer, but it doesn't really describe anything.
No, exactly. You have to go on there. I mean, all of the political crap. I mean, there you go. There's another answer for you. People and political crap. But again, there is more to it than that. And that's why these conversations get bigger and bigger and bigger. And that's why one of the main reasons why we write articles, because we like getting involved in these conversations, but they're quite difficult to hold on certain platforms. So here's an article. Any questions, shoot me a DM or respond to it here or write in the article and the comments at the bottom. It's public for everyone to see. Unless you're particularly abusive, we basically publish all comments, and we will respond to them, and we'll have a conversation there, but,
Yeah. I mean, we could use the principles of, the morality, the principles of right and wrong. You could go back to that and say, well, what do you mean by principles? Do you mean duties? Do you mean where it gets its truth maker from? Are they even truths? Is the principle of morality a truth, or is it an opinion, or is it an emotional response? So, like this conversation is showing, you can start with a simplistic definition, but like you said, it's going to have to be built upon in order to have a further and deeper understanding of it.
Yeah. And I'm looking forward to see where it goes.
Yeah, we might have to do this in a couple of parts.
Yeah, looking at the time, you're right.
And we're only a quarter of the way through the dialogue?
Oh. This is I mean, we're not even reading it out.
No.
We're just enjoying the conversation.
Yeah, that would take far too long. But the Meno is quite a short dialogue, so if you want to look deeper into this, then read the dialogue. There's some bad news in that if you want to really understand it, you have to read extra material. Like, I've got Dominic Scott's Plato's Meno, which expands on a lot of this stuff, and I've got Rosalind Weiss's book, Virtue in the Cave, which again goes into details of the characters, their lives, why Socrates chose certain answers. I've got a book about that thick just on a couple of the actual bits of dialogue, which is the paradox of inquiry. So if you really want to understand Plato, there's a lot to go extra on it. But you can get an idea of how a decent conversation and how a decent dialectic can go just from reading the dialogues.
Yeah. Fair. So, I mean, you mentioned that we're probably not going to get through too much of this. How much more do you want to try and cover off today?
Well, if I just finish with this, and then we'll leave it at that, and just we can always have a bit of a chat afterwards or something.
Yeah, cool.
So, in order to please Meno, he says, do you want me to give you an answer in the same way that your teacher would give you? So in other words, he's looking to, again, show that meeting somebody midway, and if they're starting to get heuristic, bring them around by going, well, how about if I kind of give it to you in the style that you're used to, or a style that you like? And then we build from that. So in other words, like when you're discussing with an atheist and they say atheism is just a lack of belief, and you say, well, let's just start there. That can sort of diffuse the fuse that's burning in them. Well, okay, let's start with your definition. Let's start with your definition of agnostic being only about knowledge and move on from there. So Socrates then says, do you know what effluences are? And that there's passages in which these effluences go through, and the effluences fit into some of these passages, and he gives quite a posh answer. It's a really long-winded and unnecessary, but it sounds really clever. And that diffuses Meno. He's like, oh, that's the best answer. This really posh. So, as Socrates puts it, color is an effluence of shapes of a size that fits with sight and can be perceived.
Which is basically the same answer, but just more verbose, I guess.
Yeah, it makes it sound like, well, look at all these posh words that I know.
Look at me.
Yeah.
Color is an affluence of shapes of a size that fits with sight and can be perceived.
Yeah, that's exactly it. It's like the difference between an answer that me from the Open University would give and somebody from Eton would give. Both say the same thing, but I'm more likely to be understood. Although people might not think I'm as clever as the person who's answered in this long-winded way.
But equally, the person that's answered in that long-winded way might only be repeating information, whereas you'd have thought about your answer, which is why you've given the more simplistic one, because you're like, this actually covers all bases.
Yeah, exactly. And like Meno says here, this is the best of answers. And Socrates, well, you might think it's the best because it's expressed in the way that you used to. And you could say what sound is like this and smell is like this. It's a high-flown poetic answer, and that's why it pleases you. But for Socrates, the best answer is the naive answer. It's the simple answer, because everybody can understand that answer, and you can then have a discussion with anybody and build on that discussion.
Yep.
So shall we leave it there? Because that's the second definition. And the third definition that Meno gives is what leads to it becoming really heuristic and how Socrates diffuses the argument.
Yeah, no, that's fine. I'm happy to leave it there. Yeah, no, it'd be good to carry on and come back to this. And obviously, I'll take some snippets out of it that is relevant for the next one.
And I might have got some sleep by then. And
yeah, we can only hope.
Yeah.
So yeah, LB says he's actually going to be reading this sometime. So need to see this too. Yeah, I mean, it's definitely interesting, and obviously we're not reading the actual script out. Dave's just picking bits out of it that are good for the discussion that we're having and addressing things about the way they're talking about different things. But it's actually quite an interesting script to read as I've been skimming it as he's been talking. And I'm with you. I mean, it's one of those things that I hear people talking about and gone, yes, I'm going to read that. Yes, I am going to read that. Yes, I really intend to read that one day.
Well, all of Plato's material is public domain, obviously, because it's so old. You can go to Gutenberg and get, pretty good translations of them. And the one thing that I kind of like about Plato is that he was a playwright. So he writes these discussions not just to teach you philosophy, teach you some of the questions, and teach you how to do philosophy, but he writes them in an entertaining way.
Yeah, no, that's good. It's like we were saying the other day. I think that when we were talking about education, and you get the monological teachers who sit down, shut up, copy off the board sort of thing. And then you get the other ones that actually engage you in a discussion and talk to you about their passion, and you have this discussion with them, and they teach you things without you even realizing that you've learnt them. And in the same way that I enjoy our conversations, because sometimes I come out of it thinking about lots of different things, and we've just had a chat about things that we're interested in, but we've actually learned stuff along the way. And I find that really, really sort of helpful for the way that I learn. I'm generally, if I can't, I like to have a conversation about it, or I need to just sit down and read it myself and practice it myself and all that. I mean, that's how I taught myself to program. I could never actually really do it. It was just, I need to learn how to do this thing, and then I'd look it up, and then I'd try. Okay, I've got it now. But that sort of thing is brilliant, though. The general conversation side of things, and reading it in this way, I think would appeal to me a lot more, because he's giving you entire examples of the way people communicate and how they can communicate poorly and how they can get wound up when you're starting to question them because, they think they know this. And it's really, really, really an interesting way to actually explain the whole dialectic versus heuristic sort of thing. So I guess we will have to continue this one next Tuesday.
Yeah, I'm sorry, folks.
That's all right. We've still got our Thursdays where we're breaking out at the shell, and we'll go for our new topic. But yeah, I mean, we will be continuing the Meno next Tuesday, so we will be continuing our discussions about discussions a little bit longer, but Thursday we will be covering off going more into aesthetics, so discussing the rationality of emotions in relation to fiction, which is an interesting topic, and through doing theatre studies myself when I was younger, is something that I'm a little bit more prone to understand, but Dave has some good rebuttals of things that I actually learned when I was younger and how they're not the whole picture. They're the more simplistic answer that glosses over the full context of the conversation, which is sort of akin to what we've been discussing tonight, how you can just describe something as a game, but actually there's more than just a game. There's more to it than that. Actually, there's context of the type of game, etc., etc. So, yeah. Josh says he found a great text to voice app to listen to them if you can't actually sit and read them. That's pretty good. Yeah, I mean, I think that's really useful to a lot of people. Me personally, I actually like reading when I get the time to. My biggest issue is about the only time I have to read is about 10, 11 o'clock at night at the moment, by which point I go, I'm just reading the page and having to reread it again and again and again and again. I finally read the page. I actually took the information. Like, do you ever get that, Dave, where you've read all the words, but you can't actually remember any of them? You're just like, I know I've read it. I heard my voice talking inside my head, but I don't know what
every damn time.
Yeah.
Like I said, I had to study twice as hard to be half as good. For that very reason. And even worse when I'm in a state like that.
Well, as I said earlier, Dave, I think you're doing really well. I think you've actually broken through your tiredness barrier, and you're just running on pure adrenaline and being delightful.
Yeah, that basically sums it
up. Cool. So was there anything else you wanted to cover off tonight before we sign off, Dave?
No, that's good. And I've really enjoyed this one. It's something very different to what we normally do. So
yeah, and it ties into what we've been doing recently as well, which is beneficial. And yeah, I'm up for doing this one on next Tuesday, so I'll get that one booked in after we've done the stream. And yeah, so as I said, on Thursday we're going to be doing the horror of it all, which is talking about aesthetics, breaking us away from our discussion of discussions and more into the rationality of emotion in relation to fiction.
Well, one of the things I like about this is you get a lot of people who say, well, no, I'm perfectly rational. And this kind of shows that nobody is perfectly rational.
Yeah, that's fair enough. And you'll find out why on Thursday. But if you do want to have a sneak peek at what the content could be on Thursday, there is always Dave's article called A Nightmare on Reason Street. So that can be found on answersinreason.com. So A Nightmare on Reason Street on answersinreason.com if you want to have a basic overview of what we'll be discussing on Thursday. And obviously, as I said, next Tuesday we will be covering off the end of the Meno. Hopefully we'll get to the end this time. I'll do my best not to be quite so distracted.
So will I. But it won't work.
No, it won't. So it'll probably be a 3-parter.
Well, there's quite a... We don't have to go through the whole thing. We just have to get to a certain part where showing Meno having a bit of a hissy fit and how Socrates talks him around.
Yeah. That would be awesome. I can't wait. And obviously, as Dave said, you can always check out the Meno for yourself. It is public domain. Where did you say to get it from, Dave?
I think it's called Project Gutenberg. I think
Project
they even
Gutenberg.
have audiobook versions of it.
And as Josh said, he found a great text-to-voice app to listen to them as well. So even if you can't find an audiobook for free, you will be able to get to the article and listen to it that way. So if there's nothing else, then I guess that's us for the night, Dave.
Awesome. Thank you all for joining us. And
No, thank you.
it's been really fun, yeah.
It has. And thank you, Dave, for taking us through that so far. Thank you for everybody that joined in the chat room, and thank you for everyone who's watching the rerun or any of our clips in the meantime. You've been watching the Fresh Air sci-fi stream discussing Plato's Meno in a stream called Don't Be So Meno to Me. And I'm Joe.
And I'm Plato's interpreter.
Have a good night, all.
Good night, all.
Just so you know, we tend to stream Tuesday, 8 p.m. GMT. That's 3 p.m. Eastern. And Thursday, 8 p.m. GMT, 3 p.m. Eastern. So we will be continuing to do these streams at those times, unless otherwise mentioned. But please like and subscribe on YouTube, and you'll always be informed when we go live. Have a good night, all.
Good night, all. And 100 subscribers. Yay!